for the sake of time, why don't we kick it off, right? So,
Sounds great.
like we were just talking briefly that I think the community hears enough of me talk. So I think what we want to do is allow for this webinar to kick off with Ange and Lottie here to really discuss a study about speech and language in KS and how can we understand it further and then hopefully develop some sort of interventions along the way, give parents tools and techniques perhaps. But ultimately, we want to bring the opportunity for communication to exist between our loved ones and ourselves to be able to create a better quality of life. So with that, I will pause and go on mute and turn it over to y'all. Thank y'all for being there.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you to all of the families who have joined us today. We're really so humbled and pleased to be able to speak with you and hopefully work with some of you. And some of you have already expressed interest in the study, so thank you for getting in contact with us. So my name's Angela Morgan, and I'm a professor or doctor of speech pathology based in Melbourne in Australia. And I also have our PhD student who's a trained speech pathologist, also Lottie Morison, with me here today. So we're going to talk about a study on speech and language in Kleefstra Syndrome. So yes, just a little reminder where we're based. So this is our lovely building where we sit. In our building, we have a children's hospital where I still do see children with speech and language conditions, including rare genetic conditions. And we also have a research institute that sits atop the Royal Children's Hospital. We also are affiliated with the University of Melbourne, but we're all the way down here over in Australia, sort of at the bottom of Australia, but before you get to Tassie. Yep, thanks, Lottie, you're right. And then we've got our team here. We've got Lottie, myself, Tjitske Kleefstra, so Professor Kleefstra from the Netherlands, who did identify Kleefstra syndrome originally. I'm sure you don't need an introduction to Tjitske. Also Jeff, who's been such a great supporter of the work so far. So thank you so much, Jeff, and again, needs little introduction. Dr. Milou Kennis, who's also a clinical geneticist who works under the tutelage of Dr. Kleefstra. And Dr. Emma Palmer as well. So Emma, some of you may know, who's based here also in Australia, but in Sydney, and has a great passion also for working with families with rare conditions, including running a large clinic here in Sydney for children with Kleefstra syndrome. So it was a natural pairing. So this is our core team to begin with, but we find as the work goes on, we join with many partners from Europe and the US, other really passionate people who also would like to help us better understand the strengths and challenges in communication for children with Kleefstra syndrome. Thanks, Lottie. The next slide. So this is really what drives the work. And as I'll talk about in a moment, I've worked in this area now for some time. I've been a speech pathologist for 26 years and particularly turned my focus to working with families with rare conditions over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. And what really drives all of my work is families coming to see me and asking, often, why does my child have this communication difficulty, which actually in Kleefstra syndrome, we already sort of have that knowledge, which is really such an important start. Then families also want to know, how is the prognosis for my child? When might my child start talking? If they do begin talking, when will that be? And what are the features of communication that we might see? And of course, what are the best therapies to get communication going is the other factor that families want to know. So really that drives the research across our whole program. So Jeff mentioned perhaps, or we're mentioning now, sorry, that we have studied a number of different conditions, but we're really passionate now to study Kleefstra syndrome. And now that we have Lottie, who'll be a student for the next 3 years, we're able to really dedicate our time and passion to looking at Kleefstra syndrome. But Lottie, if you move to the next slide, thank you. So this is just one of our website pages where we're looking at genetics of speech and language conditions. And so that's sort of our passion. and Lottie, if you move next, you can see there are a number of conditions that we have identified to be associated with one particular speech condition called childhood apraxia of speech. So that's something that our lab is known for investigating in a discovery way. So seeing children with apraxia who don't have a diagnosis and trying to identify a diagnosis for those families. And then Lottie, the next slide. And then more here, for example, for Kleefstra syndrome would sit here, where when families first receive a diagnosis, they go Googling on the internet, as you do. And what we like to have here is a resource for families where if you click on, say, Coulin-de-Vries syndrome, so hopefully we will have a box for Kleefstra syndrome into the near future, it will tell you things like when children might begin using first words, when they might begin to have phrases, what types of therapies have been shown to be most effective, etc. So this is sort of a resource that we're trying to build for families, a practical resource throughout our work. But as I said today, we want to focus on Kleefstra syndrome. So I think our next slide might bring us to Lottie starting to speak about speech and language. So I'll mute myself, but I just wanted to give that overarching view of our project and our study. So thanks, Lottie.
Thanks, Ange, and thank you all for having us. On the other side of the world, it's winter and it's morning here, so it's lovely to see you all enjoying summer. I guess most of you over in the US or in the Northern Hemisphere at least. So what we're looking at, as Ange mentioned, is speech and language. But to break that down and to have a look at what that actually means for the project, we're looking at a number of different types of communication. So firstly, we are looking at speech, so the sounds we make when we talk, and language. So you'll notice that I've listed these as separate on this slide, and I'll go into the next slide about why that's so important that we make that distinction between speech and language, and how this can help inform, as Ange said, our understanding of prognosis and therapies. And then the bottom two there, social communication and non-verbal communication, we will also systematically look at across children to see if this differs much between children and how, again, we can support children in their social communication development and non-verbal communication development. This last one, non-verbal communication, this is really important for the study because I was mentioning to Jeff a bit earlier, I'm particularly interested personally in this last point. So if children don't develop spoken speech, how can we use other methods of communication to support them to get their message across? So that's something I'm personally really interested in. So we'll also look at eating and drinking in this group, particularly in younger children, because this has been noted as a challenge before for some families, especially earlier on in life, but there hasn't been much systematic research into what this looks like for families. And we'll also look at general health and development information, just to gather some more information about families, but also because I'm sure you can all appreciate a child's general health and development can really affect their communication development too. So all of these domains will come together to help us understand what communication looks like in Kleefstra syndrome among lots of different individuals. And this last point, among lots of different individuals, is really important. There's only one study at the moment in Kleefstra syndrome that really looks at what communication looks like in Kleefstra syndrome, and that study has one child in it. So as we sure would all appreciate, development for all these domains looks different amongst every child. So that's why we'd like to broaden the scope so we can really understand communication more in Kleefstra syndrome. So as I mentioned before, it's really important for us, particularly Ange and I as speech pathologists, but also as families, to make a distinction between what's speech and what's language. So speech is how we are learning and to say our sounds. So we look at how many sounds a child has. Do they have all the sounds of their specific language that we expect for their age? And if they are missing some, what kind of speech sounds are they missing? And are these speech sounds clear? If these speech sounds aren't so clear, why is that as well? So this might look like a diagnosis. So here's some diagnoses here. You can have one diagnosis or you can have multiple. And the two at the bottom, childhood apraxia of speech, as Ange mentioned before, our team's particularly interested as well in childhood apraxia of speech, and dysarthria are motor speech conditions and are a bit more rare in the general population, but in some genetic conditions we see that they're much more common. And on the other hand, we have language. So language is the vocabulary, the words you use, and the grammar, so how we make sentences. So this first sentence, me went to the shop, has all the right vocabulary, but the grammar's not quite right. So we'd want to say, I went to the shops. Again, we're looking if language is appropriate for age, and we're looking at our understanding or receptive language versus the use of language, which is our expressive language. And we can also look at language not just in a spoken form, but we can look at language, how a child might use language, for example, using sign or different other types of systems. And so, yeah, it's very important to delineate between speech and language because they're very different things. They tell us lots about what kind of therapies in each of these domains might be helpful and where a child might be having challenges. So why is this study important? Besides the fact we, Ange and I, have bias because we're speech pathologists and this is our area of passion, we also hope that, as Ange mentioned, it can help families with prognosis. So understanding how speech develops over time, again, why it's really helpful to have lots of different families involved from lots of different backgrounds and individuals with Kleefstra Syndrome with lots of different ages. So this will help provide answers for families. What is the speech and language for my child? What it might look like over time after I receive a genetic diagnosis of Kleefstra syndrome. And then across at treatment, once we understand what speech and language looks like, then we can have more targeted treatment approaches so that children can get the best support as early as possible, and families can get some support with navigating this. So it helps us understand what treatment might best support this prognosis. So whether it be for spoken language or for other forms of communication as well. So in terms of our study in particular, we are looking for individuals who have Kleefstra syndrome that's been diagnosed by a genetic test. And we are happy to have anyone take part who's 6 months or older. And as I mentioned before, individuals who are verbal or individuals who are minimally verbal are welcome to take part. So minimally verbal includes individuals who might not use any spoken words at all. They might communicate mostly with those non-verbal communication behaviours that I mentioned before. And we welcome families who speak all these different languages here on the slide. So English, German, Dutch, French, Italian, Portuguese, or Spanish. And we've created the project and done this, as Ange mentioned, in other conditions, so that we can facilitate this study no matter where someone's located across the world. So when we look at what is involved in the study, we're asking participants to take part in one time period to look at a snapshot of speech and language at a particular time. So it's a combination of online caregiver surveys and online speech tasks for the participants that are verbal. So if your child isn't verbal and you would like to take part, they likely don't have to do the online speech tasks component. And so altogether, depending on the child, as we will tailor these for each child, it will take about 2.5 hours to take part in the study. So as I mentioned before, we want to tailor the surveys to the participant's age and language background. As a child who is 6 months old, the type of questions we'll be asking and the type of things we want to learn about their communication is much more different than an individual who's in adulthood. So a caregiver who wants to take part will be emailed personalised links to online surveys about communication, daily activities, speech and language, and general health and medical information as well, and information about general development. We'll also ask families to upload a copy of their genetic report. This is just for us to look at, and it's a secure link just to confirm the diagnosis for inclusion in the study. And also, if potentially, if we find any patterns with different types of genetic variants and speech and language outcomes. So this is what one of our surveys would look like from your end. And so this is a survey looking at speech and language. We have some instructions up the top, and then you can scroll down and you click on a Likert scale from 0 to 3 for each of these statements, how often your child might do this. So this survey in particular is for children who use spoken words to communicate, and for children older than 4 years old. For the speech tasks, we use a platform called Read and Lab. This is an online platform where a child and their caregiver can log on with a personalised link and password, and they complete the tasks online. So this is an example of what a speech task might look like. So we might ask a child to say "ah" for as long as they can on one breath, and they're recording here at their end. And then we get this information from our end, and we go away and we do what's called acoustic analysis on this speech data. So this gives us really rich information about why a child's speech might sound the way it is and how we can best support speech development. So some of these tasks might seem a bit funny, but they all tell us really important things about spoken language development. So now I'm nearing the end. Sorry, I speak quite fast. I'm quite aware of that. I really need to learn to slow down. So we would love to hear from you. We would really like to adjust the study in any ways, if possible, based on the questions that you have as a community, because you know your children best. And the whole aim for this study is to learn more about communication so that this can benefit families and clinicians. So if you would like to give us any feedback on the study, or if you have any questions or concerns, or anything you would like, particularly any questions more broadly about communication and Kleefstra syndrome, we really encourage you to scan the QR code or to visit this Survey Monkey link. Do you want me to, Jeff, I can put the link for this survey in the chat if that's helpful?
Well, let's do that, and we could always, distribute it via social media channels, newsletter, other forms of communication as well, to make sure that we get it to as many people as possible.
Thanks so much, Jeff. That's great. So I'll pop it in the chat after we get to the end. But this is how you can sign up as well. So this flyer can be distributed as well, but these are Angela and I's emails here. And then we also have a general email for our team and our research as well. And this is some of the information I spoke to before, just on the flyer here. And thank you so much for having me. I'll just turn off my screen sharing now.
Thanks, Lottie. So yeah, we'd warmly welcome any questions or comments that people may have. Don't be shy. It's lovely to meet everybody and hear your thoughts, comments, queries.
I actually have a question or two that I can bring to the table. The first was, we mentioned, this is kind of a 3-year project, right, to be able to study this condition. So are there deliverables along the way as you begin receiving information, just so we can, 3 years, obviously, if we were to start it right now and then, report back in 3 years, there's a lot that could happen. So how do we stay engaged? How do we stay abreast of the information that is being produced throughout the study?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I said 3 years because that takes us right through to Lottie having already published the work and really disseminated that work. So a PhD, which Lottie's embarked on, typically is 3 years full time. But the work that Lottie will do, she will try to collect as much information as she can within the first year or so that the study will be completed much quicker than within 3 years. So in terms of deliverables, usually it does usually take at least 12 months for any particular study. The largest part of the study is follow-up. So whilst Lottie families sort of register and then we get working together with families on collecting information. Of course, people are busy and they go away and they think, oh, I have to go find that genetics report, or I need to find this. So there's a lot of chase-up work that happens. But usually by the end of 12 months, we're at a position where we could give another seminar with the group to talk about the findings and outcomes within the community. And then the paper is written. And then the longest delays typically are in the review process. So one of our students who just worked in Kleefstra Syndrome had her paper under review for 5 months, which was quite infuriating. You know, that involves 3 months, and then we have feedback and we replied to that feedback within a week. And then for 2 months later, I've been chasing the journal saying this, you know, the community would like these results and my student would like the results to complete her PhD. And so then that takes up a lot of the time, actually. And we communicate the results of the paper as well with families. So there's some of the main sort of milestones. However, other things we often do is communicate with you and put into newsletters or communications. Hey, we've got 15 families signed up, or we're looking for 40 families. And so we sort of can have those regular newsletters and communications as we go along.
Awesome. Angela, I think, makes a pretty interesting point here in the chat that I think is worth having a discussion about. You know, I think so phrasing it right, it's about whether we would be able to take the time to be able to speak with personal speech pathologists along the way, right? I mean, it's I think about it kind of in our overall global data collection efforts of what we do just organizationally on all kind of the whole body, right? And so, you know, we have patient-reported outcomes, and then we have clinical reported outcomes, right? But the patients see one thing, the parents see one thing, and sometimes clinically you see something else. So would there be an opportunity to kind of fuse those two together to be able to make sure that we're getting as like a clear snapshot as possible?
Yeah, we do receive clinical reports from the local speech pathologists, etc. We just have to make sure that parents have consented for that correspondence as well, and we feel it's really important to have parents involved in every aspect of the correspondence. So we more work through parents, and so yeah, that's sort of appropriate. Where we have to be careful is being asked questions at this point about what are the best therapies, etc., because we can then get engaged in many email trails, and we don't sort of have insurance to be advising. These are not our children at this point in time who we're providing clinical care for. We have to be on the research end of the spectrum. So there's sort of a fine line that we walk. Once the paper's written, then we're always happy for people to contact us and share that information, and we try to do that also very broadly on our website, etc. So fantastic. We always do try and work with clinicians and health professionals directly, and people share reports. But yeah, that's the one aspect we just need to be mindful of, really. Yeah.
I'm back, Emma. I just saw Emma.
Yeah, I thought that was Emma. Dr. Palmer. Dr. Palmer.
Hello. I was here listening to the first bit, but I've got small children running around in the background, so I had my camera and my sound off, but it was such a fantastic talk and I'm really excited. So can I share this information now with all of our clinic families? Because I just wasn't sure on the timing. Are you happy to send that survey monkey out to everyone?
Yeah, that will be lovely. Yeah, Lottie, do you want to talk now? Sorry, I'm taking over.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. And we can also send you that flyer that we had on the slide, so you have a copy of that if that's helpful, as well, with all of the information that we chatted about today.
And the point about the impact of health is really important. And it was interesting to me, you were looking at feeding as well, so eating and drinking. We've certainly seen, I'm sure Jeff can attest to this, a lot of our families have real problems with their guts. So with their esophagus and also with severe constipation. And I think all of these things can be connected. But interestingly, and I don't know whether this will come out in your studies, some of our children are having lots of issues swallowing. And then if they have a scope, they find out they've got actually an allergic reaction in their esophagus. So that might be something that's really important as you're looking into to see if they're seeing a gastroenterologist as well, as that seems to be not an uncommon KS thing, if I'm right, Jeff.
It's a great point. I mean, there is so much interconnectedness here, right? And I think we're just, the more that we can kind of unwrap all of this mystery, right? I think we're going to start seeing that all these things are touch points for the next thing, right? And so as opposed to looking at these things in kind of the Frankenstein model where you do this piece and this piece and this piece, it's like, let's look at this more holistically and see how they all are connected, because at the end of the day they are, and then they lead to the big bad word of regression that is always in our community. All these things kind of point to that, right? So it's so important. I think we harp on data and participating in these kind of efforts so much, because it's a piece of the puzzle that informs us a little bit closer to these like really big questions that impact our community.
And I'm sure communication links to mental health and well-being so much as well. Like you touched on right at the start, that frustration if you can't get across the message that you're trying to, and the mental health and well-being of our kids is so important.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I think something else that might be interesting to discuss would be, as we embark on this focus on KS, what are some of the lessons learned or the successes that you've seen in some of the other communities? It was funny after we got connected, which it'd be fun at some point also to share like how like interconnected the whole KS research community is. I mean, it's like it's 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon kind of things where everybody kind of knows each other, and it's cool to be able to bring everybody together. But yes, even with the rare disease community, I'm talking with Ashley and the Cool and Debris team, and talking with Haley and the SET-BP1 team, and they've worked with you and you've produced these like great papers, and they're just glowingly reviewing their experience with you and how important it was for the community. So, without, over promising and under delivering, like what are some of those outcomes that are tangible that you've heard of from the families?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really nice point, as you say, too. Yeah, not over promising and under delivering, but I think the really clear deliverables that we can promise to people are having an evidence-based document, so a peer review research publication that has evidence and data to show the speech and language challenges and also abilities of the children. It does a few things. So one of the things is it really helps with insurance and funding. It helps insurers see, okay, we should be supporting speech and language for children. So that's huge because often in the early years, there is a lot of variability in children's early speech and language development across the board for any population of children. And so there is a tendency for insurers or people to say, oh, let's just watch and wait and see what's going to happen. And so maybe not provide the resources that you're desperately wanting to get in and have some intensive therapy. So that's one benefit. Another benefit, of course, is actually, again, for speech and language pathologists working in rare conditions, you might only have one child with Kleefstra syndrome on your caseload, and you've never seen another child before. So how do you know what the future could look like, or what you should be pushing for, or what you should really be tailoring therapies about. So if you can have a paper with, say, 30 or 40 kids in it, different ages, different abilities, different stages, it sort of really helps a speech and language pathologist hone what they're going to diagnose, hone what they're looking at, understand where the child they're seeing might fit in with the rest of the cohort, or whether there are some differences to pursue. So it really does lead to more tailored therapy. And also just helping other health professionals, other family members, even clinicians understand more about communication in the condition. I think they're some of the most tangible deliverables that we can definitely promise on. Lottie, is there anything you feel I've missed, or other things that you feel are important to mention?
Just speaking to your point about insurance, I have a great anecdote about that. So a recent paper we just did in another rare genetic condition, we send out the paper to all the families once it's published. And she got back to me and said that that paper, she'd initially been denied insurance to campaign for AAC for her child, or augmentative and alternative communication, and she'd gone back with that paper and then gotten that financial support from her insurer. So that, as Andrew was saying before, we've seen those specific outcomes for families being able to access services with the research behind them.
If I could add a comment, sorry. Just from a doctor's perspective, it is incredibly helpful. I must say, in giving a diagnosis, that's often one of the first questions that parents ask. So to be able to give some more accurate replies back to what the kind of range could be is really helpful, just from that very first conversation. After a diagnosis, it's such an important thing for families to know about communication. And I do take the point that speech and language and communication, these are very complex things. And actually what we are aiming for is communication, isn't it? That we're able to understand what our little one is trying to get across to us. And that's really important. And the other thing is completely right about insurance. In Australia, we have a thing called the NDIS, Jeff, and you need to every year prove that your child has needs to get the appropriate funding for therapies. It's a really horrible system, but it really helps if you can give the evidence base behind that, rather than just, I say my child needs this is the recommendations. It makes a huge amount of difference. And the other thing, and I could see there's a question in the chat, is I guess we're still learning about the differences between KS due to a little change in the gene, a spelling mistake in the gene, or a chromosomal deletion. And I was interested to see your looking for the genetics result. Is that something that you intend to look at a little bit and see if there's any differences there?
Yeah, we do that genotype phenotype correlation, and Lottie's already been a fabulous research assistant who's worked on a few studies, and so even has experience of this now in some of our different populations. But I think the challenge we're finding is that because we're still looking at rare conditions in 40 or 50 with 40 or 50 children even, we haven't always found genotype-phenotype correlation. So there are a few studies in which we've found clear correlations. I think from the top of my head, I think it's only been in perhaps Phelan-McDermid syndrome, really, where there has been one clear pattern that we've seen. Lottie, is that correct? I don't believe in the recent papers you've worked in we've seen any clear correlations.
No, but we've definitely looked. And one paper I'm working on at the moment, it seems like there might be a pattern, but it's not significant because we don't have enough kids. So maybe one day that will, I guess, come to light. There's in another condition. So that is definitely something, as Ange mentioned, that we'll look for.
It's always interesting to hear Phelan-McDermid because we have a lot of crossover with them. I mean, we talk with them frequently. Ronnie and Megan and Kate. We talk with them about GI. We talk with them about regression. There's so many similarities with our conditions. It's pretty unbelievable. So it would be interesting if we got in there and saw some results that were similar. Again, just to dive into another project that's more maybe cohesive. There's a pretty good couple of questions here in the chat, so I'm gonna hold on to another one of mine. But I think just reading directly what Michael's put in here is, can you elaborate a bit on your theory on speech pathology and KS And where do you think that the major difficulties are in the process from nonverbal to verbal communication?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really great question, and it's sort of a question of all time for many populations. But we can talk about that a little bit. And that's a great question, Michael. And it's sort of what Lottie will really be focused on in identifying in her work. And as Lottie mentioned, she has a particular passion around nonverbal communication as well, and supporting children who aren't able to speak verbally. So that's why I just knew she was the right student. You are a very lucky community to have Lottie, because few students are interested in that area, but perhaps don't pursue knowledge and learning. Lottie's already been to 2 sort of conferences and workshops, gathering all the information she can in this area. So the challenges from nonverbal to verbal communication, there are 3 core challenges, I suppose. So the first is motor ability. Does the child have the ability to produce the speech sounds? Another is cognitive ability. How is our general learning going at this time? And our cognitive ability is very much linked to language ability as well. So do you understand the words, as Lottie nicely described before, words, phrases? Do you understand the language around you and requests and things that people are asking? And do you have the language to then move forward and produce verbal language? And so untangling those features is really tricky in younger children, and tricky in children who might also have features of autism and other conditions. But this is what Lottie's work will work to untangle. In terms of theories, yeah, they're really the core theories around neurobiology, I suppose. So what are the substrates that children might have? Is your motor strip of your brain, the motor region of your brain, honed, ready to produce speech? What is the cognitive substrate there? Do you have the connections of your brain? So there are core brain regions in your grey matter or your cortex, which are responsible for movement and responsible for speech and also for learning vocabulary. And then there are also connections between all of those regions. So are we looking at where we might have differences in the way those core grey matter regions are developed, or are we looking at differences in the way the connections are formed in the brain? So there's some of the neurobiological or mechanistic theories around these areas. Lottie, did you have anything further to add?
Just to speak more broadly, obviously not specific to Kleefstra syndrome, because we don't know yet, because we haven't done the study, but we do see that children who get that really lovely nonverbal communication support, it supports their speech outcomes long term, and it doesn't hinder them. So using nonverbal communication, for example, high-tech AAC through an iPad app or Sign or whatever it may be, that bodes well positively to verbal communication development. So that's just an aside there.
Terrific.
So one question that's been kind of stirring in my mind as we've been talking, and it's something that I think that I always need to be cognizant of as we look at the broader KS community, is that, you know, we want to understand how this impacts certainly, you know, our younger population, but how does a study like this also impact, you know, your adolescents or even potentially your adults, right? I think that obviously the potential outcomes, there's going to be some variability in there, but you know, being as inclusive as possible and understanding it from every member of the community's perspective. What is the value for each member of the community at the different stages they may be in?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And we absolutely try and see the broadest age range possible, because, yeah, of course, that's going to tell us what the longer term pathway might be like, the history for individuals. And that's something that, as you're working towards, something we haven't talked about, I suppose, in terms of tangible benefits, is clinical trials and having outcome measures for different individuals at different ages. But we could talk about that at a different time. And that's why Lottie's talking about acoustic measures measures, because drug companies and pharma companies want objective, quick, repeatable measures. So that's something exciting that actually you guys are getting over the top of other conditions. We're going back to Coolin de Vries and SETBP1 and some other conditions to help them collect that information now, but you guys are getting that right from the start. So yeah, in terms of adolescents and other older individuals, the benefit often is, I mean, for adolescents, it's really lovely to have that interest, I think, still going forward as a young teenager. Lottie will have expertise in trying to communicate, and also with older teenagers who might have lost some skills, even that she still has Lottie has some skills where she might be able to still draw out the abilities of those adolescents. And so, yeah, lovely to have adolescents having a voice themselves in some way and being able to take part in the research, not just the younger children, and also for the adults. But Lottie, did you have something further to add on that account? Because you've been working a lot already in other projects with adolescents and adults and might have some further observations.
Yeah, as Ange said, it's really lovely to get, especially obviously depending on the individual's ability, but if they have the communication skills to really reflect upon their own journey. In some conditions, we see that sometimes the adolescents and adults can really give us a lot of firsthand, lovely, experience of their communication and what challenges it might face for them. And as Emma lovely alluded to before, in a really lovely way, that communication can impact our mental health outcomes. We've seen that more broadly, not so much specifically in Kleefstra Syndrome just yet, but also seeing, the long-term implications of having methods to communicate, or potentially some individuals who haven't had that support for whatever reason that may be.
Well, I don't have anything else. I don't know if you all, there's obviously interest in here. I think that that's evident, and I'm excited to be able to explore this further. And I think you're right, and that, kind of talking about clinical trial and endpoints, developing those, that's a whole conversation in and of itself that we probably don't want to try to scrape off too much today. But that's certainly, as we're building this kind of holistic vision of a pathway towards treatments and improving quality of life for our community, both the families and the patients in the community, we have to be able to identify these things by metrics. Like, we really need to hone in on measurable things so that when we go to someone and say, hey, we developed this intervention, it worked, they're going to say, prove it. And so,
Absolutely.
Anecdotal, stories will only get you so far. If we really want to push this thing across the finish line, there's so much governance and regulatory issues that we have to overcome. So the more thorough and diligent we can be along the way, it will set up for success. So we're kind of, begin with the end in mind. What's the end goal? And then work our way back and understand how we can make sure we make as many progressive steps forward without having to take those steps back. Like you mentioned, we have tools available to us now that sounds incredibly fortunate. So we're not having to be, replicating the work that's already been done just to gather it again. So that's, sometimes timing is works on your side. So
absolutely. Yeah. We've honed our skills now. And actually it was a really lovely point, the last thing I wanted to say that Emma raised too, and that you've talked about, Jeff, because I think the hardest part of this study, and Lottie will attest, I know she will, is the health and medical survey we have is quite long. And the reason for that is exactly what you spoke about before, Jeff, that what we pick up in this study might lead to future work as well. And because nobody's looked deeply at speech and language before, we really want to understand, is it hearing that impacts more? What is happening there with the feeding in the esophagus? Does that tell us that there are other structural challenges actually that might be impairing verbal communication, etc.? It's really, exactly as you say, so many things are interrelated that we probably don't yet understand. So it's just a little apology in advance to families, and to please bear with us that we know that survey survey is quite long, but we have found in some of the other conditions that it has pointed us to new information. So, for example, in Kleefstra Syndrome, we had seen a few children maybe had a little bit of stuttering in one of our earlier studies, but now we really see that is very prevalent. We also know there are some other medical conditions that might be impacting on that stuttering now from that survey. So please bear with us on that one. And where do we subscribe to the newsletter? Yeah, Lottie will share that again. And thank you so much. Yeah, Lottie's also given another email address there. But we will share with Jeff the flyer, which he could post up again for families. And further to people who've registered today, we also have had around 10, would you say 10, Lottie, families email us already from something that Jeff had already mentioned.
So exciting.
Yeah, which is fantastic.
So what's the goal? What's the highest number of participants? Yeah, I'm a competitive guy. So what's the highest number of participants you've ever had for another condition?
Okay, fantastic question. Well, this is a bit unfair because Coulin-de-Vries syndrome has been around for quite a time. When was Kleefstra identified again? Lottie knows this too, and I should know that.
Chitska's, I guess, seminal paper was around 2005, 2006.
Okay.
Not that
so
long.
similar to Coulin-de-Vries.
Same home team at Radboud, right?
Yeah,
same
exactly. Same home team. So let's get competitive with them then, Jeff. But although I'm not sure, yeah, the prevalence might be slightly different. But we had studied children and families with Coulin-de-Vries syndrome previously. So we had a paper in 2018 from a study that had sort of run for a few years when we were first starting to do this work. So you've got the smooth pipeline now too. But then we came back to our Coulin-de-Vries families because of the stuttering question and some other questions around social communication and some things we wanted to go deeper into. And for that paper recently now, which is about to be submitted, we have 81 participants.
Wow.
So that's
a good number.
It's a good number. It's our biggest number for this kind of work. I'm also on another paper, though, with Coulin-de-Vries, where they just had 239 individuals for a rare condition. But that uses a different model. That's not as deep a model. It's really just a one-hit survey. It's from the Genotype data. So they're going to publish that soon. So there we go. Let's sit somewhere between 81 and what do you think? I'm not sure. How many families do you have on the database?
Almost roughly 1,000. And you
can
referenced Genotype. Coulin-de-Vries and Kleefstra are the two prominent conditions within Genotype, right? And so I think this is such a critical piece to quality of life. I mean, I think we have to be able to just respond, right? I mean, surveys are going to take time. They're not fun, but obviously, like you just mentioned, we need to lay this foundation and make sure that it's really well built, and then we could go from there. But just engaging as many people as possible to start, and I think we could do it, especially with the number of languages you're offering the studying in as well. I think I saw 6 or 7 different languages, so that's not to be undervalued at all.
No, it's true. We do reach a lot of French European families, South American families. It has been great. That's been something we've been really passionate about. One of the challenges there is that some of the standardized tools are not translated into all of the language. So our health and medical survey, we translated into all of the different languages, and there are sort of some tools that overlap, but we can't get the complete picture, but we can get enough. And working with local speech and language pathologists, etc., it does give us still quite a strong picture. And absolutely, to get that cross-linguistic picture for speech and language, and for going forward for clinical trials when numbers are king and the drug companies are thinking about that, this sort of data can really help in that sort of approach of thinking across languages, that the phenotypes are very similar, which is what we've found in other conditions actually, which has been fantastic, because when we first started this work, people said, oh, you can't really do your work in different languages and it'll be so different, and what are why are you trying this? It won't work. Well, I'm really proud to say, well, we've shown it does work, and features are really similar, which of course you won't be surprised to hear about. So yeah, no, I think that's all really positive too. I agree. So we love to be competitive. Lottie's really competitive. She's amazing. Competitive with herself, I would say. Really tough on herself. So I have to say that she has led 4 papers as a research assistant whilst running other projects in my lab. Yes, Emma's clapping because she knows how amazing that is. And so, yeah, I really am pleased and proud to present Lottie to the Kleefstra community, because I know she will not let anyone down, or not including herself, because she's her toughest judge. But yeah, I know she'll go for numbers. Don't you worry about that, so that we can give you the best data to go forward with.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. I appreciate you waking up early your time to be able to make sure that we could coordinate the time zone difference, and just being, again, I think just having the interest that we do from your team, and it's incredibly important, and we're full of gratitude for folks that actually are taking time to look at our kids, right? Because a lot of these conditions, as parents, you feel like your kid's invisible, and that's tough, right? So, you know, the fact that you all are taking your interest here is really important to us, and we're really grateful. So now it's our turn to show up and make sure that we give you all the tools that you need to be able to execute on your vision and your job, and make this work for all of us. So really, really just thank you.
Yeah, our absolute pleasure, and we're really excited to get started. We took a little while to get going, but we knew once Lottie just started her PhD this week, so she's raring to go now. I can't stop her now. I got her finishing up the other studies so that we could give her free rein to really enjoy working with everybody. So yeah, thanks so much, Jeff. It was lovely of Emma to join too, because we are a great, strong team, and it wasn't a great time for the Dutch, but I see Dr. Kennis is on, Malou Kennis is here, so thanks, Malou. Because the Dutch component is so important, and Chitska introduced us to Jeff so that we could do this work together. You've got those nice links, as you say, Jeff. We'll talk about that at another time, maybe when we give our feedback at another stage or in a newsletter or something. But yeah, thanks so much for having us.
I see a lot of you're responding to Lauren right now, so we'll have another person to link in here as well. So we have recorded this, and we'll be populating it. So we'll kind of do some promotional efforts, making sure that everybody has the link and the ability to engage with the study and contact the team. And we'll be able to watch this back if necessary. But thank you all again, and we will be in touch soon.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care.
Have a great day. Enjoy the conference.
I will.